Thank you to everybody for coming. My name's Diane Farcetta. I'm with the Wisconsin Network for Peace and Justice. And I want to also thank David Williams of Peregrine Forum for taking the lead on organizing this event. And I think we've all experienced a debate, an ongoing debate that needs to happen more among folks on the left who are of good conscience, who are concerned about the plight of people in Syria, but also know very well what U.S. military and political power tends to do to people who are already marginalized around the world. So I think this is a great event. I look forward to the discussion. And we want to start with a couple minutes for announcements. And of course, I want to make sure that you all know, and if you haven't yet gotten, there's quarter sheets up here for a fundraiser for Syrian refugees, which is Saturday, November 9th from 1 to 4:30 p.m. back here at the Fountain with live music, including by Mideast by Midwest. So please don't leave here without getting a quarter-page sheet for that. And with that, I understand there's a couple people who want to make announcements before we get started with our actual debate. So who would like to go first?
I don't have any announcements.
David said that this would be a time that I should speak about something that happened in Chicago. So I'm Joe Osbaker, and I'm one of the panelists. I'm with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and I work with a number of groups. And one of those groups is called the Committee to Stop FBI Repression. 3 years ago, my home was raided by the FBI. My wife and I and 21 other anti-war activists around the Midwest are under investigation by the U.S. Attorney in Chicago for allegations of providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations. This case, although there hasn't been much in the news about it in the last year or so, it has not gone away. And this week, we had really disturbing and terrible confirmation that our case is alive in the eyes of the U.S. Attorney. This is the front page of one of the Sun-Times papers in Chicago on Wednesday. A 65-year-old Palestinian activist in Chicago was arrested on Tuesday by the Department of Homeland Security. She's being charged with lying on her application for citizenship, and they're claiming, as you can see, the headline says, Feds, Evergreen Park senior lied about her terror past. What they're saying is that in 1969, she was arrested by Israel when Israel illegally, militarily occupied the West Bank. They tried her in a kangaroo court, a military court, where she had no right to due process. They gave her a life sentence. She served her 10 years, and then in a prisoner exchange, they commuted her sentence and released her. Some years later, she emigrated to the U.S. She's been a model citizen, and they found this woman after 20 years in the U.S. The reason they found her is because they are investigating her boss, who's one of the 23 that was raided and subpoenaed by the FBI. And you know, most immediately, we have got to defend Rasmia Odeh. The United States government has had a war on Muslims and Arabs in this country since before 9/11, but especially since 9/11. This is a very serious case. The charges they're bringing against her carry 10 years in prison and deportation. And what sense does that make? That they would put her in prison for 10 years and then deport her? It's just cruelty and sadism on the part of our government. But that's the update. You can follow that case at www.stopfbi.net. And I also would just like to close on that by asking any organization that is willing to consider to make a statement opposed to the violation of this woman's civil liberties and the ongoing attack by the U.S. government on Arabs and Muslims in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other brief announcements that we have? All right. So I want to give you an overview of what the format will be for the event. So we'll start off. We have 4 panelists, as you can see. We're going to start off with about a 12-minute starting position by each of the 4 panelists. I am going to be timekeeper as well, so I'm going to ask the panelists to sort of keep an eye out for my signs with how much time you have left, because we also want this to be very interactive. So after the panelists give their initial statement, then we're going to see if there's any organizational responses that would like up to 5 minutes, and then go into just sort of generally question and answer discussion with engaging everybody in the room. And we really want to go, again, have this be a very interactive event, and then sort of wrap up with coming back to the panelists for about 5 minutes each. So that is the overview of how the structure of the event will be. And so I want to introduce in the order that they will speak our 4 panelists. So we have Bonnie Block with Wisconsin Network for Peace and Justice, the Committee to Ground the Drones and End the Wars, Pledge of Resistance, Raging Grannies. I'm sure I'm forgetting others. Very wonderful, very active in the Madison Community United Nations Association. How could I forget that? Anyhow, very happy to have her on the panel, and her position will be arguing for U.S. non-intervention, no military aid to Syria whatsoever, including the rebel groups, while diplomacy is furthered, and also humanitarian assistance for the refugees. And then we'll hear from Joe Osbaker, who just spoke. He is with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in Chicago, and he is arguing that what's happening in Syria is not a civil war, but a war of intervention by the U.S. through a proxy army, and that the U.S. peace movement should say, hands off Syria. That should be our position. And Earl Silvar. Okay.
Maybe we should use this.
Yeah, is this on? Okay, thanks for the feedback.
I'm sitting on it. Sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. All right, is this?
No.
This may not be on.
No on off switch.
No, not that I see.
All right,
Maybe
well,
it
just
turns at
stand
the
up.
top.
Is there,
Maybe it turns at the top. Is that?
Hello? No. Where is this?
Behind you. There's one right behind you.
All right. Well, I will speak loudly. Maybe folks can. It's very participatory already. So we have Earl Silvar, who's with the Fox Valley Citizens Peace and Justice Group of Illinois, and his position will be solidarity with the secular and democratic elements, with the opposition to the Assad regime in Syria, but not saying that the U.S. should get militarily involved with providing assistance to them. And then lastly, we'll have David Williams here with the Peregrine Forum, who's arguing for solidarity and support with democratic and moderate factions of the Syrian rebels, and for actually providing military assistance to them to end the civil war in Syria. So that is a brief outline, and with that we will go to our first panelist, Bonnie Block.
I'm going to stand up because that way I can see all of you, and wave your hands if you can't hear me or if I talk too fast. My mother always used to say, I talk too fast. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad that so many of you took some time to come out today. It's a beautiful day outside, and there are other things you could be doing. As Diane said, I've been a lawyer for 30 years, although I have not practiced since 1990, in part because I started working for state and national peace and justice organizations. I was a coordinator for the Lutheran Peace Fellowship, which is one of the 16 denominational peace fellowships that are affiliated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And I chaired the National Council, and also went on the first delegation to Iran in 2005 that the FOR sponsored. I've been involved with the Wisconsin Network for Peace and Justice. We have an anti-militarism group. I've been president of the United Nations Association, so I'm really interested in how the UN fits into all of these issues we have. And since 2003, I've been engaged in nonviolent civil resistance. Been arrested about a dozen times, primarily here in Madison against the Iraq War, but also at the Pentagon and more recently in Volk Field, where we have had a 2-year vigil in opposition to drone warfare. And they're training drone pilots in our very own state. Been arrested twice there for crossing the line, trying to deliver, in one case a letter and in one case a citizen's war indictment to the commander there. I tell you that because I think our life experiences shape where we stand and what positions we take on things. And I'm very serious about nonviolence because I see it as the primary way forward in a world that's filled with injustice and conflict. So, my mantra is, relating to drone warfare, that it is illegal, immoral, and ineffective. And that's the case I want to make to you. It is illegal because under the United Nations Charter, countries only have the right to go to war if they are in imminent danger of attack. And that doesn't mean, all of our rationales we've been giving about, oh, we have some long-term interest, or oh, we need to bring stability to the Middle East. The UN was created at the end of World War II. And it's not a perfect organization by any means. I think a good line I heard on October 24th is the 68th anniversary, or was the 68th anniversary of the founding of the UN. And someone wisely said, it's not going to bring us to heaven, but maybe it'll keep us from hell. And that's kind of what I see as the role of the United Nations. Don't get me wrong. I think what is happening in Syria is horrific and heartrending. They're talking about 125 to 200,000 people killed, 4 million people that are internally displaced, 2 million refugees, and untold millions of people who have not enough food or water. And that was before the chemical attacks, which killed 1,400 people, including children. And I have no patience with the Assad government. I want to make that clear. But I keep thinking, given that level of carnage, why would we want to start bombing? Why would we want to increase the number of people killed? Because it's kind of like saying, with the death penalty, we kill people to show that killing people is wrong. Doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. Also, I don't think the U.S. is in any position to judge another country about the use of chemical weapons.
Here, here.
In Vietnam, it was Agent Orange and napalm. We gave chemical weapons to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War when we were in Iran. I mean, that was something that they still very much remember. And there were huge, well over 1 million casualties from that war. And we used white phosphorus in Fallujah. And I think even more egregious is the really using, in effect, nuclear weapons with depleted uranium munitions. And people who've been in Iraq talk about how women no longer ask, is it a boy or a girl? They ask, is it normal? There's horrendous birth defects. I've heard 400% increase in leukemia. And this is something that's going to be going on and on because there's tons of depleted uranium munitions scattered all over Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have no proof that the U.S. wouldn't be using those kind of munitions if it bombed Syria. So I think that the other thing that we should be aware of is there is an alternative, a legal alternative to the use of chemical weapons, and that is the 15-year-old Convention Against Chemical Weapons. Most countries of the world, with the exception of Israel, it's the only country in the Middle East that has not signed on to the convention. And what is happening now in Syria, thanks in part to Russia, is they've joined the chemical weapons ban treaty, and there is a process in place to remove those. And the U.S. ought to be doing the same. We have stockpiled and used and produced chemical weapons. So I don't think we ought to be in a position to judge. There's also a legal remedy for the people, whoever it was, that was responsible for using these chemical weapons in Syria. And that is the International Criminal Court. It was created precisely as a permanent criminal court for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And so there is a process to bring to justice the people or government that did use these chemical weapons. It's not as though the only alternative we have is bombing. There is, and I should add another thing about the U.S. We have not ratified the International Criminal Court, in part because we realize that people like Kissinger, Bush, Cheney, Powell, who knows who else, would be indicted because we have actually engaged in war crimes. Okay, war is immoral. There's an interesting list, a 3-page list of various world religions and their golden rule of doing it to others as you would have them do to you. There's the international, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talks about people's right to safety, their right to not be detained, and there's all sorts of people in wars who get detained, who go into exile, and who are killed. We also ought to look at every time we start a war, who benefits? Amy Goodman had an interesting program. She was pointing out that there were 22 people, the pundits who made the case for the war against Syria. They all happened to have connections with military contractors. And these 22 people gave 111 interviews, and in 13 cases they mentioned that they had a connection. It used to be that we had wars and therefore we built weapons. Now we are making weapons and therefore we have war, because we have this military-industrial complex. It's also ineffective, and I think whatever measures you want to use, our wars, our decade-long wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, have not brought about anything good. I did some of the statistics. 4,489 U.S. soldiers or military personnel were killed in Iraq. Over 32,000 wounded. It's estimated there are 320,000 veterans who have brain injuries. Depending on the study, 13 to 20% have PTSD, and 22 vets a day commit suicide. Military contractor deaths total 3,400, although that's probably low. And then there's the Iraqi deaths. There's multiple studies, but they range from 174,000 to over 500,000 Iraqi dead. And we'll probably never know how many Iraqi people have been wounded, nor will we know how many of them are going to have the effects of DU. In Afghanistan, the numbers are 3,393 killed, 73% of them under Obama, and 17,674 are the official wounded category. It's hard to find any estimates about how many people have been killed in Afghanistan, but we know that that both maternal and infant mortality rates are the highest in the world in Afghanistan, and the average life expectancy has gone down to 42. It's hardly been an effective war. And we are now also doing drone warfare in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's been more people killed with drone warfare in Pakistan than were killed at 9/11. And we need to stop. And then there's the financial costs. We spend, according to the National Priorities Project, we're spending $10.45 million an hour in Afghanistan and $824,000 an hour in Iraq. Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel laureate economist, says that it's going to cost $4 to $6 trillion for these wars. And a Harvard study says that each American family paid about $75,000 for the wars. I personally have a lot better uses for that, and I expect you do too. So I think if we're seriously concerned about the people of Syria, we should not intervene militarily, but we should provide humanitarian assistance. We should aid the countries that have the millions of refugees. And we really, really, really need to engage in diplomacy, because I think that's the only way to solve the conflict. And long term, we need to cut military spending. If we put all our money in that, we never have money for development and any kind of humanitarian aid. So I think a military bombing of Syria is illegal, immoral, and ineffective. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And next up we have Joe.
Thank you, and it's great to be back in Madison. My son goes to school here, and my wife went to school here, and her parents went to school here, and I've been to a lot of good parties and meetings over the years. Yeah, I'm in Freedom Road Socialist Organization, but I've been heavily involved in the anti-war movement over the past several years. I was one of the national coordinators of the March Against the NATO Summit a year ago in Chicago, which brought 15,000 people out, and by many estimates constitutes the largest anti-war march ever in the city of Chicago, larger certainly than anything during Vietnam.
Very good.
And 5 years ago, the investigation by the U.S. Attorney I was talking about, that investigation began at the protest against the Republican National Convention in 2008 in St. Paul, and I was the bus coordinator from Chicago. So today I'm going to speak about what line and what slogans and what approach will best build the anti-war movement. So after the NATO march, activists in Chicago formed a new anti-war committee, and that's the group that I work with now, which has been among the leading groups in Chicago and nationally in organizing protests against the threats of war and the existence of war in Syria since last year. In August and September, when the crisis came as Obama beat the war drums, we had rallies of up to 300 and 600 people in those weeks. And so I want to talk about some of the experience and some of the lessons that we've learned through the anti-war committee work. The stance of the anti-war committee in Chicago is hands off Syria, no new wars. And as we investigated, starting a year and a half ago, as we investigated the situation in Syria, we learned that we learned things that caused us to arrive at the conclusion, as I said, that the U.S. is already at war. This war has been going on for several years, in this time, the U.S. admits sending over $1 billion in battlefield aid, vehicles, communication devices, and providing intelligence to their proxy army. But their level of involvement is much, much more than that. A March article in the New York Times this year explained, quote, with help from the CIA, Arab governments and Turkey have sharply increased their military aid to Syria's opposition fighters in recent months, expanding a secret airlift of arms and equipment for the uprising. The airlift, which began on a small scale in early 2012, expanded into a steady and much heavier flow late last year. And even before that, in a Fox News report in December a year ago, an international cargo shipper revealed that arms shipments from Libya to Syria commenced almost immediately after the fall of Gaddafi in October of 2011. And the quote goes on that the anonymous sources on the ground in Benghazi said, weapons and fighters are absolutely going to Syria, and the U.S. absolutely knew all about it. So the United States, and there's another article in the New York Times this last year where the Qataris admit that in October 2011, the CIA was in their cabinet meetings discussing who the weapons should go to. So the surprise on the faces of John McCain when he discovers that some of the Free Syrian Army are actually enemies of the United States, people that are jihadists and sectarian, driven by sectarian ideologies, is not a surprise to the CIA. They've known full well for over 2 years. So some political writers have claimed that the Free Syrian Army is part of some Syrian revolution that emerged with the Arab Spring protests in 2011. In that version of events, the revolution took up armed struggle in response to the repression by Assad's brutal military. Whatever grievances the protesters had in the Arab Spring, the Gulf monarchies and Turkey, along with the CIA, leapt in at the opportunity that was created. The U.S. was already funding rightist groups in Syria going back to 2005. And within months, as I said, the Arab Spring, April 2011, by October, airlifts from Qatar are going to Syria, and the arms are getting into the Free Syrian Army. So in conclusion, what is happening in Syria is a war of intervention by the U.S. and its puppets. The war is mainly being fought through a proxy army, and it's funded and directed by foreign powers headed by the U.S. That's why we have to say, U.S., hands off Syria. Now, I want to address the question of how the U.S. wins support at home for these wars. This has been a big issue in the anti-war movement so far. To do that, the government and the media here roll out their propaganda. Whatever government they're going after, they say, we can even do this chorally, right? They say, this is the worst government on earth. They say, this president is the new Hitler, right? They say, we are going on the side of the good guys. They say, they'll throw flowers at our feet as we roll into Damascus, Baghdad, Belgrade. And really, they said similar things before I was born in the Cold War and in their campaigns against the socialist countries. So, in my opinion, the anti-war movement should not join in with the United States government and the corporate media in repeating these statements, these messages. Our government, Bonnie has already addressed this, but she just scratched the surface. According to Korean sources, 3 million deaths of Koreans, North and South, by our government in the Korean War. According to the Vietnamese government, 4 million deaths of Vietnamese by our government. Let's not forget the 500,000 in Indonesia, which now even the U.S. admits, 250,000 in Central America in the 1980s. Actually, the biggest head count of deaths in Iraq currently is from the Lancet in Great Britain, which estimates 1 million deaths as a result of the U.S. occupation and war. And if you go back, the estimates of the United Nations were another 500,000 deaths, mostly of children, from the sanctions regime that Bill Clinton had in place in the 1990s. That's 10 million people our government has killed since the end of the Second World War, and those are only the big wars. And of course, that doesn't even begin to address the number of children that we've starved to death through corporate control of the markets and slave labor and the poisoning of the earth, et cetera, et cetera. This country is not spattered with the blood of oppressed people. We are soaked in it. We should not join our government in comparing any government on earth, even Assad, as being as bad as them. It couldn't possibly be as bad as the United States government. No country on earth is as bad as the United States government. So last I want to address the question is, why does the U.S. oppose the government of Syria? And to explain that, I want to turn to a source that you might not read regularly, but this man is, I would argue, the most popular Arab leader today. His name is Hassan Nasrallah, and he is the leader of Hezbollah. Hezbollah's popularity flows from the fact that they are the only liberation movement that has defeated Israel in the field in 40 years. In the 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon. It was not the Lebanese army, it was not the Syrians that drove them out, it was the resistance of the Hezbollah fighters. In 2012, he explained why the U.S. is against Syria. He mentioned Damascus's support of Hezbollah when Israel invaded. He said, quote, "In the war, the most valuable weapons we had in our possession were from Syria. And it's not only in Lebanon, but in Gaza as well." He's referring to the Israeli attacks on Gaza in 2008. He said, where did Gaza get the missiles from? The Saudi regime? The Egyptian regime? No, those missiles came from Syria. Also, Nasrallah pointed an accusatory finger towards the U.S. and the Arab countries aligned with the U.S. as responsible for the conflict inside of Syria. He said, quote, "The Syrian army is the only army in the region not receiving training or weapons from America. America, the West, and its pawns in the Arab world used the just demands of the Syrian people and threw Syria into war." So, in conclusion, the U.S. is opposed to the government of Assad, not because they care about Arab lives. How could they possibly care about Arabs who live on the Syrian side of the border with Iraq when they've killed 1 million in Iraq in the last decade? No, what the United States government cares about, they are against the Syrians because Syria is anti-imperialist. I want to just use one more fact. There is only one city in the Middle East, one Arab city, where all of the factions of the Palestinian liberation movement have offices: Damascus. No other Syrian country will let any of them have offices except for the Palestinian Authority. Syria's existence as an independent, anti-imperialist state benefits concretely and in reality the liberation struggle for the Palestinian people. It is a good thing that the Syrian government is independent of the United States, and it will not be if the people fighting to overthrow them now are victorious. But that is not the line that Freedom Road takes in the anti-war movement about how to unite people, because we know this is very controversial. This is something that we need to discuss and educate in forums like this. What the anti-war movement should unite around, and our signs should say, hands off Syria, no new wars. We oppose efforts to get into that war, and we also oppose efforts by forces in the anti-war movement to demonize Syria as contributing to the war effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. All right. Our third panelist is Earl.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to try and keep standing, but my tremor sometimes prevents me from being effective. I may have to sit down, so I hope you won't take that as disrespectful. I'd like to be able to see your faces and your response. Before I begin, I'd like to say it's really a pleasure to be back in Madison. I was here for 9 days during the Madison uprising back in 2011, and I remember very well how thrilled we were on those cold days when we found out that the people of Egypt were sending money so that we could get pizzas. How many people here were out in the streets back then? Most of us. It was thrilling, wasn't it, when we heard that? Because it was a recognition in very human terms of the commonality of our struggles. Even though they're Arab, most of them are Muslims, most of us are not Arab, most of us are not Muslims, it wasn't the issue. There was a struggle, and there still is a struggle, in those days very hopeful, here and there, that people could come together and stand up against tyranny, whether it was the Koch brothers who inspired and paid for your governor, or whether it was Mubarak and his family and their regime where the military run most of the economy and exploit the hell out of the workers there. There's a commonality to the struggle around the world. And I think what we're seeing in Syria, perhaps despite Joe's very able and very passionate and informed advocacy, is that there really is a civil war going on there. And even though the CIA knew about it and is playing games there, as has been described, the revolutionary movement there exists. There is a revolutionary movement that is consistent with and is following up, and of whom half the fighters have allegiance to, a movement that started out with the slogans dignity, social justice, and freedom. The masses of the people faced political repression for decades in Syria. Their jails were filled with dissidents from the left as well as from the right. People were tortured and killed by the thousands, and have been and still are in the jails of the Assad regime. Poverty was growing, which I'm going to show you. I want to share with you, instead of trying to argue with somebody or the position, I want to share with you what I've learned in the last 2 months when I've been motivated because I heard a speaker at a forum in Chicago explain that everything in Syria was all the doings of the jihadis and the Wahhabi and the ultra-right-wing conservative factions of Islam that are organized. As if there was nothing indigenous and there was nothing in the regime that caused it. Instead, we're hearing another side which says the regime didn't cause these now, it's the result of U.S. and allies' machinations and manipulations. But the fact of the matter that I've discovered and that I want to share with you is this. Despite its reputation as a socialist state, the fact is for the last 30 years or more, the regime there has been increasingly integrating itself with the world capitalist regime all the way back. Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president, back in 2000, let me get my notes straight here. In the mid-'80s, 30 years ago, wages, benefits, and subsidies were already cut. In 1991, they passed Investment Law Number 10, which opened all new areas of the economy, many new areas, to international investment and privatization. When Bahar came into power in 2000, almost the first thing they did was apply to membership in the World Trade Organization. What I'm going to try and do is trace in a few minutes, some of the internal developments that gave rise to the massive demonstrations which were very popular and which were referring to their fight not against U.S. manipulation, not against right-wing fascist, what I would consider fascist militias that were mobilized around under the banner of right-wing Islam, but by the conditions of their life in Syria under this regime. Because that was the major thing. I'm not going to argue that, I'm sure that the CIA knew a lot about what was going on. But neither the CIA nor the fundamentalists caused the upsurge that took place and for which people continue to fight in Syria, and in my opinion, with whom we should ally, we should support, and we should oppose the Assad regime, which is continually murdering and isolating and torturing and starving them. So what are some of the events that took place? Besides just applying for the WTO, what we got was the beginning of privatization, the introduction of foreign banks, which it could invest up to 49% in the companies. We saw the privatization of government land. We saw a decrease in the rent controls, an increase in speculation in housing so that housing prices went up from double to 10 times as much, which meant that the ordinary working person was squeezed, just like the ordinary people, quote unquote ordinary, like working class people are squeezed out of the cities in Chicago, in Boulder, all across the country. You pick it. Real estate is really expensive. People pay more and more for rent, but our wages don't keep up with it. The same kind of conditions are facing the people of Syria, quote unquote ordinary people. We see the free trade agreements were entered into with Turkey and other countries, which meant that the manufacturing industry was sabotaged. Tens of thousands of people were laid off in the 2000s inside of Syria as a result of this. In addition to which, there was a huge drought from 2008 to 2010. Tens of thousands of farmers, the main source of agriculture, were driven off the land, went bankrupt. At the same time that the subsidies were being cut for their pesticides and for their animal feed, so that not only was there a lack of water, but they couldn't afford the necessities of farming because the government was cutting its subsidies, and this was leading to greater and greater poverty in the countryside. At the same time that subsidies on petrol, on transportation, on diesel were being cut, subsidies on food were being cut, and the value of their money was going down as the prices were going up. In fact, the Syrian pound was reduced. 15 years ago, it was 4 pounds to the dollar, and 3 years ago, it was 48 pounds to the dollar. So that's like a decrease of 12 times in their purchasing power. So what I discovered, and what I want to share with you, is there's this increasing poverty at the same time that there's this drought, at the same time that 1.5 million refugees from the U.S. imperialist invasion of Iraq drove 1.5 million refugees into Syria, which they accepted. So you have this massive influx of refugees. You have this devastation in the countryside. You have growing impoverishment in the cities at the same time that the government is cutting the subsidies of daily necessities, privatizing, and along with the privatizing, no surprise, we get the same thing we see from Chicago to Moscow to Shanghai. And what do you see? You see crony capitalism, the same thing they had in Egypt, right? The insiders get the state industries and the state businesses at cheap. Who's the richest man in Syria today? Bashar al-Assad's cousin. So all of this is part of the condition. So when the people had demonstrations in the beginning, I think it was March of 2011, some of the first slogans were 111, Syria is one, to show that it was non-sectarian, it was not on a religious basis, it was not on an ethnic basis. They're saying this is all of us. What were some of the other slogans? Down with corruption. Why? Because this crony capitalism gave rise to a new ruling class that was so wealthy at the same time that life became harder and harsher and more difficult. So the first thing I wanted to explain is that this information that I found convinced me that, in fact, There are indigenous local roots rooted in the nature of the regime, its relationship to the mass of the people, its ever-growing integration into the world capitalist system, not complete, but growing in that direction, which gave rise to these demonstrations and which fuels a need for a society where poverty is ended, where the political repression is lifted, and where dignity can be, people can live with dignity because they're no longer in poverty. Poverty destroys your dignity. It tears away at it. You're dependent. You're worried. You don't have any security in your life. So rather than seeing this as a war of proxy armies, let us take a look at the reality that masses of Syrian people rose up. The regime of the current regime, Assad, that Joe Baker's group would have a support and others would have a support, is in fact the responsible agent, together with the Russian and the Iranian support, who arms them and trains them and sends them weapons. That's who bombed the Syrian people. That's who machine gunned them. That's who sent rockets in. That's who has started this war. And that's, in fact, the reality that the Syrian people are responding to and are struggling against. The second thing I want to suggest is that even though it's a very confused, I've been active for 50 years. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis is the first time I ever had to stand up. As Bonnie said, we have to take positions in life. We have to take a stand. And I remember the question was, if you're for the U.S., you supported the missile, you supported the embargo of Cuba. If you were for Russia, you opposed it. But what if you were for the Cuban Revolution? Where did you stand? You opposed the embargo without in any way saying that Russia was the advanced example that was going to set the world on fire or something, but to side with the revolution of the people. And it's my belief that this revolution in Syria, which has many deep problems of its own, it does not have a common center around a common program that will, in my opinion, from what I've discovered, address the changes needed to end poverty, to establish a political regime where people can openly discuss and debate, where the working class, where the working class can actually have a voice and a power in society rather than being manipulated and controlled by alien groups at the top. They don't have that. They had that in Indonesia. The communists provided that in Indonesia. They had national organization. They had a common program. You can see that in many countries. They don't have that. There's a weakness there. They don't have a movement that's fully integrated or have the support of the whole working class. It's very divided. And there's no government in the world that supports the Syrian revolution, just like there's nobody who supports the mass of the Egyptian revolution except the people themselves who need to struggle. Every government in the world is against the Syrian revolution, whichever side they're angling on. So my conclusion is we're dealing with corporate capitalism here in America, are we not? Do we not have the best government money can buy? Is it just the Republicans with Coke? We see the same attacks on labor, the working class, and the poor, and the small business people, and the farmers in New York State, which is all Democrat, in Illinois, which is where I come from, which is all Democrat, in California, which is Democrat. The same class-based assaults on working people and ordinary people and intellectuals and the youth that they are fighting against, there we are dealing with here. And my conclusion is, despite how complicated it is, we should organize on the basis of yes to the Syrian revolution and provide them all the support we can, moral, political, financial, any kind of support we can. Half of the fighters in Syria are not part of the fundamental right militias. Half are still affiliated with the ideals and the aspirations. And there are areas in Syria, which I can give you the citations for, and which you can find by Googling, where these forces are still alive, both organized fighting forces and civilian forces, who demonstrate mass demonstrations against the regime and against the jihadis, who stand up in their face, and now their slogan is 111. Assad and the jihadis are one, because they are arresting, torturing, imprisoning, and killing the liberation fighters who are true to this revolution. And I think, despite all the complications, we should side with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Earl. And then our last panelist is David.
I'm switching with Earl so Russ can videotape me. Earl's covered much of what we need to get out there about the... Earl's covered much of what needs to be known about the origins of the Syrian revolution. I would strongly urge people to get a copy of or get from the library James Gelvin's book, The Arab Uprisings, What Everyone Needs to Do, which was published by Oxford University Press last year. He has a good summary about the nature of the Assad regime and how this Syrian uprising began. Basically, despite the early mildly progressive aspects of Baath socialism, the Syrian regime had evolved over a period of decades into a regime of crony capitalism in which the Assad family and the Alawite ethnic religious sect treated the country pretty much as their personal property over a period of 40 plus years. Months of nonviolent protests were met with bloody repression, mass shootings, arrests, torture, disappearances, etc., until finally some of the protesters began to get arms wherever they could. They manufactured them. They bought them from corrupt police and army people. They got them on the black market. The Sunni private arms networks, sponsored by the Sunnis in the Gulf kingdoms, began to smuggle arms into Syria. Undoubtedly, the CIA and Mossad and Saudi intelligence, had their fingers in much of this. The Sunni reactionary regimes probably couldn't have stopped it, even if they had wanted to. But for them, they decided that they were going to ride the tiger. That this presented an opportunity to begin their own proxy war against their Shiite regional rivals, Iran, principally. And Joe has pointed to a well-publicized example of the arms shipments that came from Libya and Croatia. But what I would argue is those arms shipments notwithstanding, which were primarily light weapons, assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and so on, primarily light weapons, the Western and Sunni suppliers of the rebellion have not provided either the quantity of arms nor the kind of heavy weapons that would be necessary to change the strategic balance in the civil war. For example, the Syrian rebels have been asking for two years now for those handheld, those shoulder-held, they're called man-pads, anti-aircraft missiles that were so effective against the Soviets in Afghanistan that the West has absolutely refused to supply those. No heavy artillery, no heavy mortars, no anti-aircraft guns. I would challenge anybody to show me where large quantities of this has been supplied in this so-called proxy war. Basically, the Western imperialism's attitude toward the rebellion has been ambivalent and mendacious and treacherous. On the one hand, U.S. imperialism would like to weaken the Iranian Shiite alliance. There's no question about that. They would like to drag Iran to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the United States. Okay. On the other hand, the United States and Western imperialism and Israel, are not at all enthusiastic about the possibility of a rebel victory in Syria. It's not as likely now as it may have looked a couple of years ago. But even a couple of years ago, the United States, was fearful, and so the United States' attitude was, well, we don't want the weapons to get into the wrong hands. And the irony here is that through the West's refusal to effectively arm the moderate and pro-democratic forces in the Syrian uprising, it has been the jihadis through the Sunni arms networks, and facilitated by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, it's the jihadis that have come to prominence in being foremost in the combat zones, the most contested combat zones in Syria, and so in a way the West has facilitated the rise of the jihadis, and of course this is another excuse not to provide sufficient aid to the moderate and democratic opposition in Syria. Also, it should be pointed out at the very beginning of the rebellion, and there's an article in Der Spiegel, which I'm happy to pass around, in October 10th, that at the beginning of the Syrian uprising in March 2011, Assad once again released jihadis from the country's prison. Simultaneously, tens of thousands of Syrian students, liberal activists, and human rights advocates began being arrested. Their fates were recently documented by Human Rights Watch, which alleges that many have been detained, arbitrarily tortured, and subjected to unfair trials. At the beginning of the uprising, Assad vilified his opponents as members of al-Qaeda, which wasn't true at the time. Some critics of the regime now claim that by releasing the jihadis from prison, Assad's intention was to quickly radicalize the opposition, discrediting it in the process. If that was his aim, it has certainly been a success. All we hear about these days with regard to Syria is the jihadis, the jihadis, the jihadis. Okay, with their, the lurid video of the jihadi eating the liver of a dead Syrian soldier went viral. But what really didn't go viral, in the past several years have been all of the massacres, all of the organized massacres that were carried out by the Assad regime in the first year and a half of the war, with the aim of terrorizing the population, the civilian population, not to support the rebels, but also to hopefully provoke retaliation, by Sunni sectarian retaliation, which could, then be used by the regime to frighten the Alawites, to frighten the Christians, to frighten the other minorities into thinking that the Assad regime was their only hope of survival, in a sectarian war. Okay, and in the book, which I would recommend, Syria Dilemma, edited by Nader Hashami and my friend Danny Coastal, which is available on the table there from sliding scale of $10 to $15. There's a piece in there by a civil society activist named Juedi, and what she says is that in the West, they keep hearing about the jihadis, but what we say is, don't count our beards, count our dead. Okay, because we're in the United States, in the West, what we've been doing is we've been counting their beards. Okay, now I've been an opponent of U.S. imperialism since I was 18. When I was here at Madison, Wisconsin, my 4 years at UW, I was active in the Vietnam anti-war movement, active against numerous other U.S. foreign interventions in wars. And if I'm advocating, for military aid to the democratic and moderate Syrian rebels, it's not a position that I take lightly. The way I view it, what is happening in Syria is that the people fighting for democracy and for liberation from a cruel and repressive regime, a reactionary regime, quite frankly, are caught between two imperialist blocs. We have Western imperialism, which has dominated the region, for over 100 years since the end of World War I, and then you have, with the collapse of the Soviet of the socialist bloc, you have another imperialist bloc led by Russia, which is a capitalist imperialist country. I mean, let's face it. Iran is a capitalist country. You have China's a capitalist. Well, that's arguable, state capitalist country. But you have a rivalry between two imperialist blocs, and the way I see it, I would like to live in a world where the United Nations, had the authority, and the backing to intervene to stop genocide or to stop repressions. I'd like to see a world community governed by agreed upon norms of international law and human rights. But I see a world that is basically a battleground between two imperialist blocs, which are basically like two gangs of gangsters, two factions of gangsters. Okay, and the people in Syria who want their freedom to be liberated from the mafia dictatorship of the Assad family, they happen to be caught on the wrong side of the geopolitical divide that some people feel that anti-imperialism today still means, like it did for some of them, during the Cold War, it means allying with, regimes that are arrayed against the United States. If Syria, is against the United States and Iran is against the United States, and we ally with them. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, I say, that is not true revolutionary internationalism. We need to support the revolts of oppressed people everywhere, no matter which side of the geopolitical divide that they are on. Okay? But by the same token, if some people on the left are operating with the logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then I say that the people struggling in Syria to survive Assad's killing machine they have the right to get military support in order to survive from anywhere within the two imperialist blocs in the world. Okay. Finally, I just want to address the question of not adding to the bloodshed. Okay, because we keep hearing this. If we help this, militarily the Syrian rebels, we're adding to the bloodshed. It's precisely the refusal, the treacherous policy of the West to provide enough help to the democratic and moderate Islamic forces in Syria that has emboldened the Assad regime and made it feel that there's a military solution, that it can crush the rebellion. I say that appeasement hasn't worked in this situation, just like appeasement never really worked historically when it came to fascist dictators. And although it may seem counterintuitive, that by calling for aiding the Syrian rebels, that it would add to the bloodshed, unless the Assad's killing machine is stopped, unless the Assad regime and Russia and Iran realize that there has to be a meaningful negotiated solution to this war, then the bloodshed's going to continue and it's going to get worse. Thank you.
Thanks to David and to all of our panelists. Now, before we open up to general comments and questions, are there organizations who want to do an organizational response?
Sure,
Mr.
thank you.
President?
Not breaking bread, but we're sharing water.
Yeah, with this United Nations Association, State President John Quinlan. Now? Barely. Okay, maybe I need to project.
The ice machine is running really loud, so.
Okay, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to, the United Nations Association, where I'm state president, has been debating this on national conference calls, in our individual chapters, and in trying to figure out, I guess, constructive ways to proceed here. I think of what the panelists have covered so far, you established important historical background, you got a sense of kind of, while we have some differing opinions about how different things are playing themselves out, I think this is all valuable, but I guess what we're really trying to emphasize are the human costs of what's occurring. The unprecedented number of displaced refugees, how this is impacting not only on Syria, but also on neighboring countries that, by and large, are invoking the Arab traditions of hospitality and really trying to bring in people and trying to do good things. But the profundity of a civil war and what that represents, I think, has different solutions maybe than other conflicts that we've had in the past. Peace-related solutions, getting people to the same table, things that aren't necessarily dependent on arming one side or the other, are all things I think we need to explore. I think those are our options within the United Nations, at least when the United Nations is working well, when the U.S. and other countries are having a positive role and not just looking out for their own interests. So I guess I would like to just open up that I think we need to move into as best we can. I don't think anyone's necessarily talking about isolationism here, to let things play themselves out entirely, but instead to have some kind of a proactive, peace-oriented approach to all of this. So I just encourage us to maybe frame some of our thoughts and questions as we move forward in the discussion, in those lines. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John.
I forgot to hand this out during that.
Okay, great. Are there any other organizations that would like to? Okay, so then, organizational response?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a response, it is a comment, and I'm Azam Nirmandarad.
You'll have to really shout.
I know, I mean, that would be hard. I don't have big lungs. I am Azam Nirmandarad, coordinator for Amnesty International Local Group 139 in Madison, Wisconsin. I have been born and raised in Iran. Came here in 1966 for my education. Ever since, as an adult, I started to analyze what is the politics, what is the justice, what is the human rights. I learned that, beginning, that the world is divided into two, parts, as it was said, But now, as I'm getting older and more involved with the amnesty groups and many other, as a citizen in this country, I have realized that it's really the international cooperations which is buying our government, interest groups, and they are really everywhere, and they are the one, who are affecting, so-called war and peace in the world. So I think my solution obviously is never military, because being in Iran, I know what the human effect of it can be. But I think, it is education, just like the way we are doing right now, but not just to ourselves, because we are kind of informed, public, but to the general public, and also to have a way of relying our intent to our representative. They are the ones, who are actually, are making decisions, on how much money should go where and to the military. And just say that we do not want our money to go and be spent on these. We do not need to be the world police, and we want, do to others as you want them to do to you. We want, peace for everyone, not just for ourselves. And lastly, we should change our lifestyle, because the way what we are enjoying in this country and in other free world is because of the resources that we are using from all other countries, whether it is the Middle East, whether it is the Africa, whether it is, Arctic, all these areas, resources we are using in order to keep our lifestyle.
Thank you. That's a great point. So how I want to do this, we're going to open it up to general questions and comments. So I want to take a couple, maybe 3 sort of questions, comments from the audience, and please, when you speak, just let us know if you want to direct your question or comment towards a particular panelist or not. And then after getting a couple of questions or comments from the audience, then I'll go back and see if the panelist has any responses, and we'll just sort of go back and forth like that.
How about putting down the names of the people who speak so that everybody has a chance to do it?
The speakers list.
And
Yeah.
A stack.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
I think you
So you, and then Barb, and then Ellen. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to take a slightly different position than anybody else.
I think it's a lot.
It's best,
Completely different.
best to
I
stay
think
there.
that I would champion from the very beginning a peaceful solution, not only on moral grounds, which is obvious, but on practical grounds. There really were from the very beginning only two possible forces of real military power in Syria. One was the Assad government, and the other were the jihadi side. For all their dedication and heroism, the democratic secularist side was not composed of people who were ready to fight a war, who were capable of fighting a war. You don't get heavy weapons, use heavy weapons, unless you're trained. And they were not, unlike the jihadis, unlike Assad, they were never in a position to fight a war against Assad. The jihadis barely were. And what we've seen happen is we've seen the secular forces have now given up, essentially. They've been absorbed into the jihadi organizations, or they've gone home. There's really only two left now, jihadis and Syrian army. So best bet from the very beginning, I think it was probably obvious to everyone who wanted to see a decent outcome. Best bet was to have a diplomatic struggle, not a military struggle. The military struggle is going to be a disaster. It is a disaster.
Great. And I have Barb and then Alan, and then just to keep things, that was a great length. So just to keep things moving and more interactive, we're asking for this portion to both audience members and panelists to keep remarks to a couple minutes. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Nichols, and I'm president of the UNA Dane County chapter, and I have a question. It's an operational and a definitional question. Would the panel please explain the operational definition they are using when they say this is a proxy war? I think there are multiple definitions, so I need to know when you are using that, what is the reference point? Proxy war. Thank you. That's what's left of my New England accent.
Thanks, Barbara.
That was a good one.
And Alan?
Yeah, I think I can speak from back here. Actually, I have some definition of questions as well. One is, I want to know what the West is. Okay? It's an ideological construct, and I don't know how to understand it otherwise. Secondly, to talk about a nation being anti-imperialist, from my understanding of the term, is that you also have to be anti-capitalist, okay? Opposed to the highest stage of capitalism. Secondly, I want to caution, because running through this book, in almost every instance, somebody throws around the notion of humanitarian intervention. As I said on my program on war with Danny and Hashemi the other day, humanitarian intervention is an oxymoron, because that too is an ideological and political construct which the United States and the imperial powers use on a pick and choose basis. Okay? When Samantha Power, the major figure that's put forward the responsibility to respond,
Protect.
R2P, she was sitting with military leaders at Harvard, right, strategizing the U.S. goal. Now another final point, then I'll be quiet. I don't know what a call for arming democratic secular forces coming from us means, right? Because that would mean having to shape and push and prod and affect either U.S. policy, right? And so now I agree, David, I agree that it's the right of these people to get weapons where they can. but I don't know at this point what that means anymore. Right? And there was one other point, I'm sorry, but again, I urge people to be on guard, certainly around the whole discourse on humanitarian intervention. Again, it's an imperial construct, and we have to be on guard against it and to critique it continually. Thank you.
Thank you. Trying to figure out amplification back here. So let's go back and let's give a couple minutes for the panelists to make responses to those comments and questions, and then we'll go back to the audience for see if there's more questions or comments. So who would like to?
Well, I don't know your name, but the first speaker was raising the point that the secular forces had no weapons and training and couldn't really possibly carry out a successful war, if I could paraphrase you. So when the American Revolution started against the greatest empire in the world, they didn't have heavy artillery. They didn't have great armies. They went up against the biggest army in the world, the biggest empire in the world. When the working people of Paris went up against the government in 1848 and 1871, they didn't have the biggest armies, but they did start out with popular support. They did start out with a section of the population that was ready to fight. And they did use a political strategy to isolate their enemies and to build their supporters, and to use a military strategy that started from their weakness but could build on their strengths, to generalize and to be a little bit empty about it. When the Vietnamese fought against the Chinese for hundreds of years, against the French very successfully in the 50s, and against the US very successfully in the 60s and 70s, the Vietnamese didn't have B-52s, they didn't have artillery. They did get support from Russia and China, that's true, but they didn't start out as equal fighting forces. Revolutionary forces, always and of necessity, are going to be militarily weaker against the states that are representing the classes that oppress us. That is not necessarily a reason that we have to lose. That's all. I'll just leave that at that.
I'll stand up too. I agree. I think diplomacy is the only possible answer. I don't see that, you know, the Quakers have a wonderful bumper sticker. It's called "War is not the answer," and I think that's true. In terms of proxy war, I think how I would define it is when you have parties at war, but really the funding and the support is coming from people outside. You know, I think Central America was a key example of how it was an internal civil war, whether you want to look at El Salvador, Nicaragua, or whatever, but we were funding one side. And so that's, I guess, how I would define it. And I agree with you. I somehow, for me, the R2P, the responsibility to protect, I don't see how you do that militarily. And it's come about because most of our wars now, actually, are not wars between countries. They're civil wars, internally. And usually between the haves and the have-nots. And it is usually big countries. I mean, even the International Criminal Court, which I support, you look at the people who've been indicted. They're primarily the countries of Africa, and it was used against the former Yugoslavia. And it has been big countries sort of picking on littler countries. And I think that is a reality. And so I have a problem, too, with this, you know, responsibility to protect and get involved in internal wars. I think that's all I want to say.
Well, I'd like to start by addressing that proxy war question as well. I didn't use the term proxy war. I said proxy army. I don't see, you know, people have referenced earlier the international laws that govern war, and there are international laws that govern war. When a country is under attack by foreign armies, they have the right to request and receive military aid from allies. The Syrian government is under attack by foreign-backed armies. And I want to say why I use the term proxy armies is you have to recognize what the United States, the situation the United States is in today. The United States has been forced backward. They have taken great losses. The U.S. government has taken great losses militarily and politically since 9/11. the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq did not work out the way they thought they were going to work out. And the reason they didn't is because the people of those countries were willing to fight and die in order to, keep, whatever, it's their countries. They fought and died, and they're still fighting and dying. So the United States, politically, can no longer invade with its own army. They can't do it. They can't do it logistically. They can't do it politically. So instead, they're turning to black ops, drone warfare, and proxy wars. And what they're doing in Syria is a proxy war. I also want to actually respond to this, brother. I didn't get your name.
Joe.
Joe. I'm Joe as well. My tocayo. I'm sorry, proxy armies. They're using their proxy armies to fight their wars. Sorry. I don't think that Russia and Iran providing aid to. I don't think that qualifies this as a proxy war. It's proxy armies. If it is, it's a one-sided proxy war by the U.S. only. Anyway, but I think you have a very sober assessment of what has actually happened in Syria over the last 2 years. I think there is no middle ground. And if there are independent forces, political forces, they will have no role whatsoever when and if the Assad government falls at the hands of those foreign-backed armies. Syria was not a utopia. It's not socialist. When I say I'm an anti-imperialist, I'm an anti-capitalist.